Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today, we're diving into a tense confrontation where a young woman walks straight into the territory of power, refuses to be bought, and chooses heartbreak over control. What happens when love is tested not by distance, but by authority and consequence? If you find this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Diep stepped into the woodwork shop at the exact moment the saw shut down. The metal shriek cut off mid-note, leaving behind a thick, uncomfortable silence that seemed to press down from the low tin roof. Sunlight slipped through narrow gaps overhead, cutting the space into pale strips where fine sawdust floated slowly, like it had nowhere else to go. The air smelled of fresh sap mixed with machine oil, sharp and heavy in the lungs. No one spoke. The workers kept their heads down, hands busy but movements cautious, as if everyone understood this moment didn't belong to them. A folder landed on the work table. It wasn't slammed. It wasn't rushed. Just a soft, deliberate tap that carried finality, like a door quietly locking. Diep didn't flinch. She stood upright, shoulders back, arms resting naturally at her sides. The harsh light revealed the exhaustion she had been carrying for far too long, but her eyes were steady, clear, awake. There was no fear in them, and if anyone was looking for weakness, they wouldn't find it there. Across from her stood Mr. Hoan, James's father. His sleeves were rolled neatly to his forearms. His posture was straight, unyielding. He looked calm in a way that only men who were used to being obeyed ever truly are. Calm not because the situation was peaceful, but because he believed he was in control. "There's an easy way to end this," he said, his voice smooth, almost gentle. "You walk away from my son, quietly, cleanly." Diep's eyes flicked to the folder for half a second. She didn't need to open it. She already knew what was inside: money, conditions, a narrative carefully prepared in advance, a version of events where she disappeared politely, where people could say she left for the right price or because she wasn't strong enough to stay. "And James stays safe," Mr. Hoan added, as if offering reassurance, as if this were a favor. Diep lifted her gaze to meet his. When she spoke, even she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I didn't come here because I'm afraid," she said. "I came because I'm angry." Something shifted in Mr. Hoan's eyes. Not guilt, not discomfort, interest. The kind of curiosity a man has when a problem doesn't behave the way he expected. "You came a long way," he said, "for someone who claims she wants peace." "I don't want peace," Diep replied. "I want to breathe." Mr. Hoan placed his pen down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. "I don't know what you mean." "You do," she said, taking one step forward. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just enough to close the space between them. "You sent James overseas. You made him chase debts that weren't his. You blocked him from coming back to Vietnam, not because it was necessary, but because it kept him away from me." Somewhere deeper in the workshop, someone coughed. The sound echoed once, then vanished. No one moved after that. Even the building itself seemed to understand this wasn't a normal conversation. "You're speaking as if you have proof," Mr. Hoan said, folding his arms. "I have the pattern," Diep answered. "The timing, the people involved, the way things always happen right when they need to." A thin smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Polite? Empty. You're imagining enemies because you don't like reality." Her throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. "The reality," she said evenly, "is that you're trying to split us apart because I'm poor." The words landed without force, but they cut clean, like a blade placed gently on the table between them. "I don't care about your feelings," Mr. Hoan said, his voice cooling. "I care about my son's life. And you think I'm a stain on it. I think you're not his match, he replied without hesitation. Different worlds, different standards. Love doesn't pay for consequences. Diep held his gaze, unblinking. You're not protecting him, she said. You're controlling him. He leaned in slightly, his tone calm, instructional. Control is what keeps people alive, Miss Diep. Then explain fat, she said. There was a pause, small, almost invisible, a blink that lasted a fraction too long. You shouldn't speak about people you don't understand, he warned. I understand enough, Diep said, her voice tightening. He came to me with a threat dressed up as a promise. If James came back safe, I had to leave. Behind a tall stack of timber near the side wall, a shadow shifted. James had followed her. He stayed hidden, close enough to hear the faint tremor beneath her words, close enough to step in if his father crossed a line, but he didn't move. Stepping out now would give his father exactly what he wanted, a confrontation, a justification, a reason to tighten control and call it protection. Mr. Hoan pushed the folder slightly closer to her. You came here because you're scared, he said. I'm offering you a way out. Diep inhaled slowly, the air heavy in her chest. If James comes back safe, she said clearly, I will leave him. Behind the timber, James's breath caught. Silent, sharp, like the first crack in a breaking wall. If James comes back safe, Diep repeated, I will leave him. For the first time, Mr. Hoan's expression softened, not with sympathy, with satisfaction. Good, he said quietly. Then you understand your place. This isn't my place, Diep replied. It's my choice. He tapped the folder once. Sign it. If I sign, she said, you'll show it to him as proof that I left for money, or because I was weak. His smile widened slightly. You're learning. I'm not signing. The air in the workshop seemed to tighten. Even the dust hanging in the sunlight stopped drifting, as if the room itself was listening. You already agreed to leave, Mr. Hoan said, stepping closer. Why resist the clean version? Because my promise is mine, Diep answered. Not your document, not your trap. Her breath shook for the first time, not from fear, but from pain. The kind of pain that comes when love demands loss as proof. I promised, Fat, she admitted quietly. If James returned safe, I'd step away. I thought if I gave you what you wanted, the pressure would stop. It will stop, Mr. Hoan said. For you, Diep replied, not for me. James clenched his fists behind the timber, knuckles whitening as he listened. Hearing how far his father had pushed her felt like punishment he wasn't allowed to interrupt. You think my son will thank you for abandoning him? Mr. Hoan asked. I'm not asking for thanks, Diep whispered. I'm asking for him to live. You're still the problem, he said coldly. Diep lifted her chin. I can leave, she said. I can keep my promise, but you can't make him stop loving me. A crack appeared in Mr. Hoan's composure, small but real. You underestimate your son, Diep continued, just like you underestimate me. She stepped back, slow and deliberate, ending the conversation rather than escaping it. I will leave him, she said, but I will not sign your lie. If you walk out that door, Mr. Hoan said, his voice low and controlled, don't expect mercy. Diep paused. It was only a moment, but in that pause lived everything she had lost already and everything she was about to give up. She didn't turn around. She didn't look back at the folder, the table, or the man who believed control was the same thing as love. I stopped expecting mercy a long time ago, she said quietly. Then she walked away. The door creaked as it opened, and daylight poured into the workshop in a sudden, blinding rush. The brightness hit her hard, forcing her to blink. Outside, the world moved on like nothing had happened. Motorbikes passing, distant voices, ordinary life continuing at its usual pace. It felt unreal, like stepping into a different reality too quickly. Behind her, the workshop stayed frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. The folder remained on the table where it had been left, no longer a weapon, but not quite powerless either. Mr. Hoan stood still, his gaze fixed on the doorway Diep had just disappeared through, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Then, from the shadows near the stacked timber, someone stepped forward. James. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He simply emerged, letting himself be seen. Mr. Hoan turned sharply. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough," James said. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous beneath it, controlled, restrained, like a blade kept in its sheath by force of will alone. "You shouldn't be here," Mr. Hoan snapped. James didn't answer right away. His eyes moved instead, drawn to the open doorway, to the empty space where Diep had stood just moments earlier. Something crossed his face then, pain, pride, anger, all tangled together in a way that made it hard to breathe. "You wanted her gone," James said finally. "Now, you'll see what happens when she is." Mr. Hoan scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." James stepped forward and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "This isn't drama," he said. "It's consequence." He didn't wait for a response. James turned and walked out of the workshop, his pace fast but controlled, every step purposeful. Outside, the sunlight felt harsh, but he barely noticed it. His focus was already locked on the street ahead, searching for Diep among the movement of people and noise. He spotted her a short distance away. She was walking steadily, not running, not breaking down. Her back was straight, but something in her shoulders gave her away. A tension, a weight she was carrying alone. James called her name once, his voice cutting through the street sounds. "Diep." She stopped. Slowly, she turned around. For a second, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other, taking in what the other already knew. There were no questions left, no explanations that hadn't already been said. "You heard," she said. James nodded. "All of it." "I didn't want you to," she said softly. "I know." They stood there, the distance between them feeling much larger than the few steps that separated them. "You shouldn't have gone alone," he said. "You shouldn't have followed," she replied. A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. "That's never really stopped me." Diep looked away first. "You can't fix this," she said. "Not by fighting him, not by staying." James exhaled slowly. "You think I don't know that?" Silence settled between them again, heavier now without walls to contain it. "I meant what I said," Diep continued. "If you come back safe, I'll leave." James's jaw tightened. "That wasn't your choice to make." "It was the only one I had," she said. "He wouldn't stop." "And you think leaving me will?" "It'll stop him from using me," she answered. "And maybe that's enough." James shook his head, frustration breaking through his calm. "You're not the problem." "I know," she said, "but I'm the leverage." That landed harder than anything else. James ran a hand through his hair, looking away, as if trying to outrun the truth in her words. "He thinks this ends something," he said. "He's wrong." Diep met his eyes again. "Then don't let him turn this into hatred. Don't let him make my leaving meaningless." James laughed under his breath, short and humorless. "You're asking me to be calm about losing you?" "I'm asking you to stay alive," she said. "And free. Eventually." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And what about you?" Diep hesitated, just for a moment. "I'll survive," she said. "I always do." James searched her face, looking for something, permission, maybe, or forgiveness. He didn't find either. What he found was resolve. "You think walking away makes you strong," he said quietly. "I know staying would destroy us," she replied. Another pause. Then James nodded once. "Then this isn't goodbye." Diep didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. "No," she said, "it's not." They stood there a moment longer, memorizing each other in silence. Then Diep turned and walked away again, this time without stopping. James watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Only then did he turn back toward the workshop. Inside, Mr. Hoan was still standing where James had left him. The folder remained untouched. "You made your point," Mr. Hoan said. "Now it's over." James looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing his father clearly for the first time. "No," he said. "Now it starts." Mr. Hoan frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't get to decide my life anymore," James replied. "You don't get to choose who I love or who I lose. I did this to protect you. You did this to control me," James said. "And it cost you more than you realize." He reached for the folder and pushed it back across the table. "I won't sign anything either," he said, "and I won't pretend this was for my good." Mr. Hoan's voice hardened. "You think defying me makes you free?" James met his gaze, unflinching. "No, but it makes me honest." He turned away. As James walked out of the workshop for the second time that day, the folder stayed behind, closed and useless. The power it once held drained away, leaving only paper and promises that no longer mattered. Outside, life continued as usual. But for the three of them, nothing would ever be simple again. Diep walked forward, carrying loss with dignity. James followed his own path, carrying consequence. And Mr. Hoan stood alone, realizing too late that control could never replace love. The silence he had created was finally his alone. Diep confronts James's father in his wood workshop, refusing to be silenced or bought despite intense pressure. Mr. Hoan believes control is the only way to protect his son and offers Diep money and conditions to leave James for good. Instead of submitting, Diep exposes how James has been manipulated, sent abroad, and trapped by obligations meant to keep them apart. Though deeply hurt, she makes a painful promise to leave James if he returns safely, choosing love over possession and dignity over lies. Hidden nearby, James hears everything and realizes the true cost of his father's control. When Diep walks away without signing the agreement, James follows, understanding that her departure is not weakness, but the consequence of choices made in the name of power and protection.